This is my favorite handout. It's about 25 years old. I've photocopied it 5,000 times. It's called The Journey of Grief. And I'm going to do one of my pictures for you in a second. But basically, what we have is the death happens, and we go through a period of shock. When I was with hospice, everybody's expecting the person to die, and we had an inpatient hospice, so I was at the bedside frequently. And we're working with the families. They know this death is going to happen. The person would die, and they would go about thanking the nurses, and they would pick up the person's belongings, and they would interact with the mortuary. And on more than one occasion, they would turn to me and say, "Gosh, this is easier than I thought. I thought it would totally fall apart." They're making phone calls, they're informing people. Well, the reason they're able to do that is because they're in shock. They really don't know what that loss means. Unfortunately, as time passes, remember when I asked when their loss was? And we're going to examine normal grief first, because disenfranchised grief, everything changes. So this is in regards to normal grief. Someone dying of cancer, you know ahead of time, or even, well, accident. This shock period lasts longer because it has the element of surprise in it. But a terminal illness, we do pretty good. This usually is around 2 months. 2 months worth of shock. Get the will read, figure out what to do about your house, odds and ends. But we're able to do it. And then you begin to notice what this loss really means in your experience of living life. And that shock subsides, and we move into a time of, well, maybe it really didn't happen. I'm going to wake up and this is going to be over. Or we start to have this confusion, or we're not productive anymore. We begin to have feelings and emotions about it, and we start to feel, oh, I don't know if I can get through this or not. And then we try to find answers, we try to find meaning in life, and we come down here. This entire journey, by the way, is a typical 2-year process. So these are, I'm going to say, 3 months to about 9 months. Where do you think the highest risk for major depression and suicide is? 4 years? 6 months. 6 months, 6 to 9 months. As a matter of fact, when I do grief work, you can't come to my grief bereavement group unless you're past 2 months. Because you're going to be sitting there with all my other people saying, "Why is this so hard for you?" And I don't want them to know that this is on the horizon. Okay? So to do a everyday normal grief workshop, bereavement group, we're looking and screening people, and we're looking for folks who are basically 2 months to 2 to 3 years. 5 years, it's a different group. 4 years, that's a different group. Okay? Okay, so you begin to understand what this loss is about. It doesn't get better, it gets worse. Start to lose hope. It's never going to get better. And then gradually some healing starts to happen, and we rebuild a life, and we pop out over here. Now that's the theory, and we see that quite commonly in garden variety death and dying. But this isn't garden variety death and dying, is it? This is my interpretation of that. Okay, here's shock, 2 months. Here's 6. Here's 2 years. Now there's a couple things I want you to notice about this graph, and this is true up here. If you look closely, do you see that where you end up is higher than where you started? Why do you suppose? Any ideas about that? You're not shocked anymore. Healing, strength, those are parts of the journey. knowledge. God, you guys are great. How many people have heard of Erik Erikson? What did Erik Erikson say about crisis? Only two things can happen. One of them is growth, and the other thing that happens is decompensation. We don't make it, and it stops us, and our growth stops. This is regard to stages of development. That's why adolescent who has a significant trauma still acts like an adolescent and they're 45 years old. Erikson would say, well, that's because they got stuck from their trauma at an earlier age and couldn't continue their psychological development. Well, what grief does, if it is processed in a fashion that's about healing, grief changes us. We are never the same. So if we have this horrible thing that happens, we process it, and this takes a lot of work. Moving through this is a lot of work, and you will be different. And you will be wiser, stronger. You will have gained from your challenge, and I'm here to tell you that you grew. Okay? Does that make sense? And that's why even here, way up there, they call it reinvestment, but way up there is higher than where they started. That's the ideal, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing.